Wow, these are even sharper. These are sharp. Are you on the market to buy a 35mm lens? I can help with this video. 9 lenses, well actually 10, I have one more here, I'll show you in a second. And for each of these lenses we'll look at example photos in Lightroom and compare which of these lenses is best at f2, f2.8 and at f4, looking at center sharpness, color saturation, bokeh, contrast, 3D pop and anything else in terms of the general look of the image. Hello, welcome, Matt here from MrLuck.com. Today I have another mass lens test for you. I've got 9 lenses here plus one extra. So let's go through the 9 lenses, but first let me mention the one that I couldn't show you. So the first lens that I wanted to show you but I couldn't is the Jupiter 12 35mm f2.8 lens. Now this is a special lens because it's one of the few lenses which won't work on quite a few cameras. The reason being it has a really huge rear element. So this lens will fit on a Leica M camera, but it will not fit on a Leica CL and it will not fit on my Leica SL. As with my other lens reviews, all photos were shot with the Leica SL and the 7 Artisans closed focus adapter. And if we look at the depth of the rear element of the Jupiter 12, you can see that it's going to hit the inside of the camera. So that's why it won't physically mount onto the Leica SL. The good news is I was able to test all of the 9 35mm lenses that I own, so let's quickly have a look at each one. First we have the Minolta MD W.Rokkor 35 2.8. This is Minolta mount, so I needed to use a Minolta to Leica adapter to be able to use this lens. Next we have a popular lens, the Voigtlander Nokton 35 1.2. This is the version 2. It's quite a big lens, quite a heavy lens, but it's a good performer. Leica Summicron-R 35 f2 lens. And this lens is the only one in the test with a built-in lens hood. Again, this is Leica R mount, so I needed to use a Leica R to Leica M adapter. I'll put a link in the description to the adapters that I use. Next, the Voigtlander Ultron 35 1.7. Some people don't like the thin nilled focus ring on this lens, but it's a really good performer. Well, we'll see in a second. Then on the bottom, we've got the super pocket size, again very popular Voigtlander Skopar f2.5 lens. Really nice size, and it's got the focus tab design. This is the Voigtlander Nokton Classic 35 f1.4. The sibling of this lens did very well in the 40mm lens test. So this is the 35, again with a focus tab, and this is the multi-coated version. Now this lens, some of you may not be aware of. This is the Zeiss Opton Biogon Contax RF mount. So it's mounted onto an adapter, so I could then mount it onto Leica. The adapter is a bit like this, but instead of it being Nikon to Leica, it's Contax to Leica. See my video on the Contax and Nikon to Leica adapters if you want to know how to use these lenses. One geeky point, if you are going to buy this lens to use on certain cameras, there's 2 versions. There's an old version and a new version. The Biogon version has a smaller rear element, meaning you can mount it onto a lot more cameras. And the non-Biogon version, which I also have, looks a bit like the Jupiter 12 with a larger rear element, meaning you can't mount it to quite a few cameras. So make sure you get the Opton Biogon if you're going to buy this lens, if you like the results. Next, another vintage lens. This is the W.Nikkor C 35 f2.5 lens. So this is also a rangefinder lens. In this case, it's got an adapter on it, but I would use the Nikon to Leica adapter. Do be aware, if you're a Nikon shooter, this will not fit your, say, Nikon FE2, for example, because that's an SLR camera. And this is from the earlier Nikon rangefinder cameras, like my Nikon S2, for example. And last but not least, we have the super cute looking vintage Leica Summaron 35 f3.5. Now let's see which is smallest. For any of you that know your Skopars, it's a very similar length, but it's a more narrow design. So if you like little lenses, this is a really great lens. Hopefully it'll be a good performer, we'll find out. Okay, so I've sorted the lenses into lens mount to hopefully make it a bit easier. I know a lot of you are Leica shooters, so the middle 4 are all Leica M mount lenses, rangefinder coupled. If you're like a 3 shooter or screw mount lens shooter, say a Voigtlander Bessa R, for example, this is a screw mount lens. Those 2 lenses are Contax or Nikon rangefinder mount. And on the right, we've got the Leica R, which I've been using a lot recently, and Minolta. So as mentioned, I use my Leica SL to test these lenses. I set the camera up on a tripod in the garden and use my roller cord camera as a model. And then I tested each lens wide open, f2, f2.8 and f4. Okay, so here are the test photos. Top left, we've got the Leica Summicron-R 35mm f2. Next, we've got the Minolta Rokkor 35mm f2.8. Next, Voigtlander Nokton 35 f1.2 version 2. Following that, the Voigtlander Ultron 35 f1.7. Next, Voigtlander Nokton 35mm f1.4. Then the Voigtlander Skopar 35mm f2.5. Then Zeiss Biogon 35 f2.8. Then the vintage Nikkor W.Nikkor C f2.8. And lastly, the Leica Summaron 35 3.5. So because all of these lenses are different speeds, we'll start with the fastest lens and then we'll work our way through to all lenses at f4, which is what we're seeing on the screen at the moment. So the only two lenses in the test with the maximum aperture of f1.4 or faster is the Nokton 1.2 on the left and the Nokton 1.4 Classic on the right. Both of these lenses are shot wide open, so on the left it's at 1.2 and on the right at 1.4. You can see obviously at 1.2 you're going to get a really smooth bokeh and a really nice kind of foreground background separation. The 1.4, because it's at 1.4, there's more bokeh detail, and I'd say they're probably both similar in terms of the vignetting and the fall off. If we zoom in to check the sharpness wide open, the focus point is on this number here, same as on my previous lens tests. I would say that wide open the 1.2 is sharper look than the 1.4, although the number here on the 1.4 does look pretty sharp. This is sharper than this. The 1.2 is slightly sharper, so if you want a fast 35mm of the two in the test, the 1.2 is sharper, and that's obviously going to give you nicer bokeh because it's a 1.2 lens. If you can cope with an f2 lens, we now have the choice of the Leica Summicron on the left, the Voigtlander 35 1.2 again, the Voigtlander Ultron 35 1.7 and the Voigtlander Nokton 1.4. So looking at this, the Summicron has got the heaviest vignetting from my eyes in terms of the bokeh. This seems to have the most fall off, with maybe the Ultron with the second most fall off. That would make sense because both of these lenses are near wide open, whereas the 1.2 and the 1.4 is slightly more stopped down. In terms of image quality, I'd say the Summicron is the most lackluster, if that's the correct term. It's got the least pop. If you look, these are really popping out of the background as if they're almost being cut out, and maybe a bit less than the 1.4. So in terms of brilliance, I'd say in 3D pop, I'd say it's between the 1.2 and the 1.7. If we now compare sharpness, on the left we have the Summicron and on the right we've got the Voigtlander 1.2. So even without zooming in, you can see that the Voigtlander is a much clearer looking image in terms of high contrast, better sharpness and 3D pop look. So everything just really stands out really nicely. Look at the blacks here compared to here. The Summicron is a lower contrast lens looking at this. If we zoom in for the sharpness, the Summicron isn't bad, wide open. There's good detail here on the Summicron. The 1.2, because of the increased contrast, just looks so much sharper. In terms of resolution, I think it's misleading because of the lower contrast. I'd say there may be similar sharpness, but the apparent sharpness is better on the 1.2 because of the contrast. So if we keep the 1.2 as the benchmark, so now we've got the Voigtlander 1.2 on the left, Voigtlander Ultron 1.7 on the right, both lenses at f2. I think the Ultron has got the best 3D pop of those two lenses. Feel free to write in the description below, but to me this is really jumping out, and this one is, but maybe not so much. If we zoom in for sharpness, yeah, the detail is really good on the 1.7 and it's not bad on the 1.2 as well. They are close, but I think it's interesting the fall off as we get away from the center on the 1.7. I think the detail is much better on the 1.7. So now the lens to beat is the 1.7 Ultron. The 1.7 is more front focused, the 1.2 it looks like it's slightly further back focused, perhaps. Very close, but we'll go with the 1.7. So now on the left we have the Voigtlander Nokton 1.4 and on the right the 1.7. Again, the detail here, look, on the 1.7 is sharper than on the 1.4. The writing is pretty similar on both lenses here, slightly more glow on the 1.7. Sharpness again, it's similar. The 1.4 isn't bad at all. Again, it's close, but I think the 1.7's got a slight edge. If we look at again a 3D pop look, the 1.7 for me wins on 3D pop. But as I say, let me know in the comments, you may disagree. So these are all the lenses at f2.8. You can see heavy vignetting on the Minolta, which has now joined the fight. That's obviously wide open, so it's showing the heaviest fall off. The Summicron still showing quite a bit of fall off. The 1.2 not so much. The Skopar also joining the group again close to wide open, so this one's also got a bit of vignetting, but not to the extent of the Minolta. We also have the Biogon, which looks like it's going to be the lowest contrast of these 8 images, and also the Nikkor, which has also got a lot of fall off and perhaps the most swirl look, although the Minolta's also got a bit of that, and maybe even the Leica. So the Voigtlander lenses seem to have the least swirl. If you look at this image here, I'm only looking at the bottom corner, so you don't need to see the top. So here, no swirl, here, no swirl. So that Voigtlander, here, no swirl, Voigtlander, here, no swirl, Voigtlander, and then swirl, Nikkor, a little bit of swirl, Minolta, and maybe a tiny bit of swirl, Leica. So yeah, Voigtlander lenses are non-swirl looking. In terms of 3D pop, I'd say it's not the Summicron, not the Minolta. I'm edging towards the Ultron 1.7 as the most 3D pop. Maybe the Skopar second, would you agree? Not the Biogon. The Nikkor is not bad as well, probably because of the higher contrast. And the 1.4 is not too bad, I suppose, but maybe still the 1.7. Let's check the sharpness. So first 2 lenses, we've got the Summicron-R on the left, Minolta on the right. The Minolta is pretty good actually. Minolta lenses are cheaper. For those of you that don't buy Minolta lenses, they offer great value for money. And look at the detail here, it's really sharp. The Leica's maybe sharper here, but the Minolta's definitely not bad. Maybe slightly sharper. The Leica might just have the edge. Yeah, the Minolta's done a really good job there. I'm impressed. I don't use the Minolta lens very often, so this is maybe a reminder that perhaps I should. Okay, sharpness. These are probably the 2 to beat. On the left, the Voigtlander 35 1.2. On the right, the Voigtlander Ultron 1.7. You can really see the increase in terms of pop and general vibrance from these 2 lenses, to my eyes, helped by the increased contrast and just the clarity, I think. If we zoom in, so this is at f2.8 now. The 1.7 looks sharper to me on the teeth around the edge. On the number here looks sharper, reasonably similar. I'd say, if I'm being fair, I'd say that looks slightly sharper. The plane of focus looks different on the 1.7, where this looks slightly sharper now than here. Again, very similar, but I think the 1.7 wins looking at this detail here, but feel free to make up your own mind. Okay, next, again, 2 more Voigtlanders, Nokton 1.4 on the left and Skopar on the right. First impressions, the Skopar is really sharp here, which is really nice to see for a small lens. Looking at the teeth detail, I think the Skopar is going to beat the Nokton, which is great for me because it's a really good walk around size lens. Yeah, sharper here, look, sharper here. Yeah, Skopar easily wins over the Nokton. Well done, Skopar, good. So the last pair to look at, we've got the Biogon on the left and the Nikkor on the right, Nikkor W. Wow, that Nikkor is sharp. That detail is really good there, look. The Biogon looks front focused. What I mean by that is there's such a shallow depth of field, even though it's a 35mm lens, because it's in close. The front of the lens here is in focus, and then just a centimetre backwards from the front of this lens going away from the camera, this is now shallow depth of field and out of focus. This seems to be more centre focused, or maybe it's just sharper, but this is in focus and this is in focus. If we zoom in, the teeth detail is really good on the Biogon. The Biogon's strange, it's a lower contrast lens, so I think it is picking up a lot of detail, but it's not as sharp as perhaps some of the others. The Nikkor is the opposite, it's a very high contrast lens, but it does have good sharpness. If the plane of focus is the same, I'd say the sharpness could be equal, because I do know from past experience that the Biogon is a really good lens, but the high contrast of the Nikkor makes it look sharper. So the best 2 were the Skopar and the Ultron. So if we now do Skopar on the left, Ultron on the right, who is going to be the king of the lenses, shot at 2.8. If we go to the top first, the Ultron is looking sharper, even though there's a little bit of glow on the top. In the centre, yeah, I think the Ultron is going to win. Similar sharpness, or maybe slightly sharper here, slightly sharper here. Right, so the Ultron wins at f2 and at f2.8. Okay, so now we have all 9 lenses included, because now we have the Leica Summaron at f4. This is an f3.5 lens, so this is at f4, well, all lenses at f4. You can see it's a low contrast lens with a lot of flare compared to the other lenses. In terms of the most poppy looking image, I'd say not the Leica, not the Minolta. The Nikkor looks quite good. The Voigtlander 1.2 looks quite good. The Voigtlander 1.7 looks quite good. I think it's between those 3 for 3D pop. In terms of vignetting, the Minolta still shows quite a lot of fall off compared to the other lenses. Okay, let's check sharpness. So first up again, we've got the Summicron versus Minolta. Both lenses are now looking nice and sharp on the center point, and the numbers are looking much sharper as well. The Minolta's got a slightly lower contrast than the Leica by the look of it. Good teeth detail here and here. Both lenses are suitably sharp, and there's not much difference between them, I don't think. Wow, these are even sharper. These are sharp. On the left, we've got the Voigtlander Nokton 1.2. On the right, the Voigtlander Ultron 1.7. But obviously both f4. This looks slightly sharper than this, but this number looks sharper than this. So it might be the slight plane of focus difference. These teeth look sharper than these teeth. Those look reasonably similar. This looks sharper here. So the 1.7 is going to beat the 1.2 just. They're two of the highest performers, and you've still got nice bokeh look in the background. The 1.2's got slightly smoother bokeh balls, and the 1.7 you're starting to see the edges of the blades a bit more. Nice colours as well, all very similar looking colours. So yeah, both really good looking images from the two Voigtlander lenses. Okay, next we've got two more Voigtlanders again. So the Nokton 1.4 on the left and the Skopar 2.5 on the right. Similar looking bokeh, and colours all look very similar, I think, although maybe I'm looking at the background, colours look similar but maybe slightly bluer on the camera body itself, and this is maybe slightly warmer looking here. Look, let me know if you agree. Okay, we zoom in. They're both really good actually. Maybe slightly prefer the colours of the Nokton to the Skopar in terms of the non-warm cast in this example. In terms of centre sharpness, I think the Skopar beats the Nokton. This is sharper than this. The teeth is sharp on the Skopar as well. These numbers are similar. Maybe the Nokton wins. It might be because of the slightly higher contrast by the looks of it. This is slightly lower contrast. We just go to the bottom. Very similar on the Xenar word. We zoom out. Those two lenses are both very similar, but maybe the slight edge to the Skopar perhaps because of this detail. Okay, good, both good lenses. Okay, next we've got the Biogon versus the Nikkor W. So lower contrast lenses mentions the Biogon, and then if we zoom in, you're starting to see much more detailed bokeh. So less round bokeh on these vintage lenses because they have fewer aperture blades. See here, you've got the more hexagonal style bokeh that you sometimes see with old lenses. Okay, so first impressions, wow. That Nikkor is super sharp. The Biogon seems to be front focused again, where the teeth look really sharp here, but it seems to have a shallower depth of field. I'm not sure if that's the lens to design. Any experts below, let me know. When it's in focus, the Biogon looks really sharp, but the fall off seems quite apparent. The Biogon's got lower contrast, but still looks sharp. The Nikkor has higher contrast, and this looks really sharp. This looks slightly back focused on this one, or the focus point being further back because the front teeth don't look as sharp. Now for any of you black and white shooters, if you like a lower contrast lens, let's compare the Biogon to the Leica Summaron, because both of these are low contrast lenses, but the Summaron is even more of a low contrast lens, partly due to the extra flare in the image. In terms of bokeh, you can see it's smoother bokeh on the Leica versus the Biogon. If we zoom in for sharpness, the Leica is sharp. Considering this is close to wide open, the vintage little Leica lens is really sharp. Look at that sharpness. That's really impressive. If you want a low contrast, high resolving lens, the Leica Summaron 35 3.5 looks a really good deal. That's really impressive, and it's a really nice size, and it's like a thread mount, so you can fit it onto your Leica 3 cameras. And just to finish, if we just go back to the Leica versus the Minolta to see the bokeh, it's not as pronounced as I thought it'd be. The Leica bokeh is not too hexagonal yet at f4, and the Minolta looks very similar. Again, not as pronounced as both the Biogon and the Nikkor lenses, both of which you've got a lot more detail. Okay, so what's the verdict? I'd say the best lenses of the test would be, if you want a sharp low contrast lens, perhaps look at getting the Leica Summaron, which is a thread mount lens. It's also perfect if you like the Leica 3 cameras. Low contrast, high resolving from my test. If you want the most 3D pop and probably the sharpest lens in the test, I'd look at the Voigtlander Ultron 35 1.7, and that was closely followed by the Nokton 35 1.2. I'd say those two are reasonably similar. The third lens that stood out to me was the Skopar 35 2.5, and if you're looking to get a walkabout lens, despite it being perhaps very slightly softer than the Ultron and the 1.2, in terms of the size difference, it's kind of a no-brainer to walk around with the Skopar instead of these big fat heavy lenses. So definitely worth considering if you want a walkabout lens and you're going to stop the lens down anyway. If you want a fast lens for kind of bokeh and portraits, I'd definitely look at getting the 1.2. That would be my personal favourite for bokeh. And if you want a fast lens for shooting at night, I would look at the Ultron, because this lens gives you really nice sun stars, shot even close to say 2.8 onwards. So really good lens for night photography. Another great low contrast, high resolving lens was the Biogon. I've got good results from this lens before, so I would recommend this lens. And if you enjoy your vintage lenses and want perhaps a bit of swirl and a bit of 3D pop from the higher contrast, perhaps look at the W.Nikkor 35 2.5. Sorry, I think I said 2.8 earlier. So in summary, in the test results, none of them really gave a bad image. I enjoy using the Leica Summicron-R on my Leica R camera, so even though it seemed to perform perhaps one of the worst in this test, in real terms it can produce nice images. And again, equally, if you're a Minolta shooter, it can produce nice images. It just might not have as much of a pop as perhaps the Ultron and the lenses I just mentioned. Before we wrap up, despite me mentioning that the 1.7 is the best of the test, the actual best of the best is not amongst these lenses. The best 35mm lens I've ever used in terms of sharpness is not the 1.7, it's the 35 Apo by Voigtlander. See that video if you want to see full details, but that lens did outperform my 1.7 when I tested the Apo lens. So if you want the ultimate 35mm and you don't mind a slightly bigger lens, I would recommend getting the Apo. Now in terms of prices, the most expensive lens is probably the Voigtlander Nokton 1.2. Most of the others are probably roughly between £300 to £400, with the exception of the Minolta, which is probably by far the cheapest, perhaps £100. Don't quote me on these. I'll put a link to eBay below for used prices. And if you want to buy a new lens, you can still get the Leica Skopar, the Nokton Classic, the Nokton 1.2, but the version 3, and the Voigtlander Ultron. All of those you can still buy new. And if you buy from robertwhite.co.uk website, use my discount code in the description and you can get 5% off. Check out those links for both used prices and new price. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And as always, a big thank you to my patrons. See you in the next video. Bye.